He who believes will never die. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes will live and will rise. He's reminded where I have said, remember me, the brain of the bread. If you believe, then you shall live. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. Number 6, please.
What's that look like?
Number 6, heaven came down.
Oh, yeah. 6. Number 6. Okay.
I will never forget when I was walking in darkness away. Jesus, my Savior, I live. Oh, what a tender, compassionate friend. He met the need of my heart. Shadows and failing with joy I am telling. He made all the darkness depart. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross my Savior made me whole. My sins are washed away, and my life was turned to day. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When heaven came down and glory filled my soul. Okay, number 7.
Number 7. Which one is this? No.
His name is wonderful. His name is wonderful. His name is wonderful. Jesus, my Lord. He is the mighty King, master of everything. His name is wonderful. Jesus, my Lord. He's the shepherd, the rock of all ages. Almighty God is He. Bow down before Him, love and adore Him. His name is wonderful, Jesus my Lord. Thank you. Thank you, Lord. Okay, questions?
Well, that's great. We need a bus. We need a bus.
You always do.
Okay, watch it.
What now?
Oh, it's okay. You can watch me. I like that. All right. So what very important commands did God give to His people in Deuteronomy 7? Liz Janice?
Well, I had more than one command, so I don't know. Okay. I had to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, burn their idols, destroy the Canaanites, and don't make covenants and don't intermarry. And the why is that because it's the lineage of Christ?
To avoid idolatry, potential idolatry, and to keep the lineage of Christ clean. Okay. Point out 5 things we need to know about Rahab. I said 5 here, but could be more if you know more. So what do we know about Rahab? Who she was?
She was a harlot.
She was a harlot.
Or a prostitute, whatever you want to
Mm-hmm.
She harbored the Christian guys.
Uh-huh.
Enemy.
She despised. She was a Gentile. Where did she live?
Jericho.
On the wall?
In the wall of Jericho. Verse 15 actually says that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
She likes
Did
to
she have
hang out a purple thread.
oh, wait a minute. That we don't know yet.
Oh, we don't know
Oh,
that.
we don't know yet. That we don't know yet.
I
But
found out why. Oh.
what about your family? Did you have a family?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but she had an expensive family.
Big
And
family.
she wanted to make a deal with the two spies that not only would she be saved,
Mm-hmm.
but all of her family.
Very good. Okay. All right. What else do we know?
She hung out a purple thread.
Okay.
Yeah, I got purple on, brother. So does she.
Tim is going to.
Or give me a little help here, buddy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Tim is going to teach about this tonight. So I go ahead and.
She had faith in Israel's God.
Mm-hmm. So how did she know about God?
Well, she saw what happened to the Canaanite and somebody other Hittites or somebody,
So
and
she heard about it.
yes,
Mhm.
and God allowed the armies of Israel to destroy them. I mean, yeah.
Mhm.
And so she heard about that, and it was the destruction was so bad that the people in Jericho had lost heart
Mm-hmm.
about even attempting to fight the Israelis. So,
They were terrified. That's right.
pardon?
They were terrified.
Yes, they didn't even like it. Yes,
Mhm.
and yeah.
Okay. Anything else? She was a Gentile, right?
She was a Gentile.
An Amorite? I think so. Was she Amorite?
Yes.
She was Amorite.
Keep that in mind.
All right.
She heard that they killed the Og and Sihon, the two Amorite kings. So she knew about that.
Okay.
They weren't just any Amorite kings.
I know.
They were
Big kings.
Giants.
Yeah.
giants.
Okay. So can we say that she was chosen a long time ago by God's will?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why her? If you read Matthew chapter 1 about genealogy of Christ, you can see her name there.
Right.
She is in the lineage of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
Gentile woman, and I think Tim will say more about it tonight. Okay. Jen, you have something to add? Okay, all right. What information did two spies learn from Rahab?
Oh wait, I did have something.
What they learned?
Mm-hmm.
What did they learn from Rahab?
Oh, they learned how to get out of town because
Yeah.
they escaped through the window because it was her place was on the wall, and she told them to go a certain way and hide out for 3 days until the guys that were hunting them came back to town. And so they did all that, and fortunately for them, then they were able to go on back to the Jordan. Matter of fact, I think they crossed the Jordan where the camp was. And
But what was their mission of those two spies?
well, they wanted to see what the fortifications were and all that kind of stuff. How
So they went to investigate
yes,
about
but they got more and more.
Jericho.
Pardon? Yes.
Did they bring any military information?
I'm sorry, what was
Did they bring any strategic military information back to Joshua?
Oh yeah, they knew from Rahab that there wasn't any will in the army to fight. So it looked like a no-brainer.
Okay. So basically what they learn is that the population of Canaan and Jericho was morally
Discouraged.
demoralized.
Demoralized, yes.
Okay. So what do we learn from this story about lying? That was an interesting one last time.
Yeah.
About lying. And
It's all right, Jim.
is there any justification for lying? Because Rahab obviously lied
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have something many times. Please.
I believe God, this is just my opinion on this. I believe God understands if we believe that the lie is for His greater good in the big picture, truly believe that it is our only choice, and then I have like basically the intent. And I wondered, I mean, would never know, or maybe God doesn't imply things, but maybe in the commandment, thou shalt not lie, maybe the implication was supposed to be for evil. Because there's lots of evil reasons to lie. Or lying can be an evil thing. So I don't know if that's...
So in general, according to Bible, lie is a sin.
Right.
And God hates lies.
Mm-hmm.
However, in some specific situations, for his own purposes, God sometimes allows things happen and people have to lie to accomplish his purposes. Because if Rahab would say the truth, those two people will be dead.
Right. Well, in Hebrews 11:31, she was not condemned for lying. And also another place where lying was used, Jacob lied to his father, which was suggested by Rebekah, his mother. And Jacob is the one that God favored over Esau.
Yeah, and I think if we dig through the Bible, we'll find many examples of that. So it was her faith that was the issue, not her lie. So that's what we learn from that. And the last one, how can we title the story about Rahab? Because it's an amazing story. And we learned only half of it. So how do we... Tim gave a very good name for it last time.
Oh, I don't remember his. I made my own.
That's okay. You need to make your own.
I have Gentile believer honors God's will.
Good.
Good one. Okay.
I said Rahab's faith helps the Israelites.
Tim said last time it is a story not about what is right, what is wrong, and not about justice, but about God's grace. God's grace. Okay, thank you guys. Wonderful. Michael,
All right.
good job.
Okay, everyone got your outline?
We never got to the thread.
It's for tonight.
We'll get to the thread.
For the next time, Michael.
Oh, we're not done with that.
Get ready.
Okay, you have an outline, and I think you should have passed out a paper on the genealogy of Christ, too. Got those? All right. So let's go to...
Does everybody have the outline? Okay.
Let's go to the book of Joshua, chapter 2. We're going to pick up. We're going to start here. Let's read verses 12 through 14 first. Joshua 2, 12 through 14. So, now she's addressing the spies, the two men. And she says, now when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you, that is, the Jews.
Where's the see? Where?
11.
I'm sorry, I just went back to 11, and I'm going into 12, okay? All right? And she affirms he is God in heaven, on earth, and above, okay? Which is a very interesting conclusion she comes to, because it raises the question, which I'm not going to go into tonight per se, how could she know all that? But I think that some of the things we're going to cover tonight, I hope give you a very distinct idea that Rahab was a chosen person. And I'll try to give you some evidence to show you that she was a chosen person.
Well, I think God revealed it to her. Mm-hmm.
I think he did. I think he had his hand on her all along.
Mm-hmm.
So 12, 13, 14. Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you might also deal kindly with my father's household, and give me a pledge of truth, and spare my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters with all who belong to them, their relatives also, their children, and deliver our lives from death. So the men said to her, our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours. And it shall come about, when the Lord gives us the land, that we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. So we have this refrain actually 3 times about dealing kindly and faithfully. The word kindness here in Hebrew is the word hased. And as I note here in your outline, it's used over 250 times in the Old Testament.
Wow.
And it means loyalty or compassion. But it's more than just a word, it's a concept. And it usually involves an agreement, a pact, an oath. It actually was a formal agreement frequently used in the Old Testament as, quote, a binding agreement between 2 parties to the performance of a particular act or promise. So actually she was asking them to agree to something that was almost a formal legal agreement. Okay? And she actually wanted a second thing to signify it too. So, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the performance component, of course, was, as I protected you from harm, that was her part. Okay, you will, if you, then you're supposed to protect me and my own. And if you don't protect me, it will cost you harm. And they say that about themselves. Mm-hmm. They say that about them. It's part of their part of the agreement or the oath. Now, I think it's very interesting. Remember, so many things that we read and the stories that we read are typological. They're very typological. And I think this is an image of God's saving work for the believer, where God costs himself harm, called the cross, in the process to keep his promise to those that he acts towards or loves. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very interesting image also of grace, of forgiveness. You know, God also put himself in a formal agreement by starting back all the way in Genesis 3:15. That formal agreement is, I'm going to bring about a person who is going to be a savior and who is going to undo the consequences of the fall. Yes?
They were not to make covenants with this group of people.
They sure weren't.
It's almost like a covenant.
It is a covenant. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it's a formal covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now you're going back to last week's. I don't know if anyone has last week's outline. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's Deuteronomy 7, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
yeah. Maybe you should read that. Does someone? Maybe we should go back. We're really close. Let me go back to Deuteronomy 7, because again, that's again. Remember, one of the things I titled last week was I called it The Enigma, an apparent contradiction. So let's go down and starting in 2 of Deuteronomy 7. And when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, you shall defeat them. All right? So do they end up defeating everyone in Jericho?
All except Rahab.
All except Rahab and her family, so they don't do it. And look what he says. You shall utterly destroy them. Did they utterly destroy everyone in Jericho? No. You shall make no covenant with them. Strike 2. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We're reading that covenant. And then you shall show them no favor. Did they show anyone in Jericho favor? They absolutely showed she and her family favor. Verse 3, furthermore, you should not intermarry with them.
Which Rahab did.
Which Rahab did. And we're going to get into that tonight. And you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. So, strike 3. Isn't it interesting that God breaks his own rules to accomplish a very important thing? I hope you see how important it is tonight as we go into it. Now, she wants a pledge. Another word that we could use would be a token. It is a sign or an evidence of the promise. If you want to put it this way, in legal terms, for instance, we could call it a down payment. Right? You show evidence. You have earnest money. You put down something that's yours to say, I will perform the contract. I will carry it through. That's what she was asking them. Now, the word here in the Hebrew, it's used separately. You notice it says she wants a pledge or a sign. It's the word aleph. And, of course, it's an interesting word because it was first used in Genesis 9:12. God said, after the flood was over and the water receded, he said, I'm going to give you a pledge, okay, for you. And that pledge was the rainbow. That's the word right there, the aleph. So this was, of course, the first use of it was for God's pledge to humanity. But here, it's a different kind of pledge, but it's also a pledge of grace. Just as the rainbow becomes a pledge of grace, that God will not judge in this way again, they're giving her and agreeing to give a pledge of grace also for she and her family. Now, let's move on and let's go start down and read 15 through 21 of Jeremiah 2. I'm sorry, Joshua 2. So, and then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so she was living on the wall. And she said to them, go to the hill country, lest the pursuers happen upon you, and hide yourself there for 3 days, until the pursuers return. Then afterward you may go on your way. And the men said to her, we shall be free from this oath to which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land you tie this cord of scarlet, which means red, okay, in the window through which you let us down, and gather to yourself into the house your father and your mother and your brothers and all your family household. And it shall come about that anyone who goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be free. But anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on his own head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be free from the oath which you have made us swear. And she said, according to your words, so be it. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. Now, does this
Her words sound like Mary, mother of Jesus. Let it be to your servant.
That's true. Yeah, it's a similar sentiment, isn't it? Yeah, it's very good. Now, notice the parallel here. What parallel comes to mind?
Passover.
The Passover. It's another image of the Passover. Let me read it to you. Back in Exodus 12. Let me read a couple verses starting in verse 12. He says, God says, I'll go through the land of Egypt on that night and strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and beasts, and against all the gods of Egypt I'll execute my judgments. I am the Lord. In the same way, when Jericho is taken, what happens after the walls fall? They strike down everyone.
Right.
Just as God struck down the Egyptians, okay? And then in verse 13 of Exodus 12, and the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over. Okay? Same idea.
Mm-hmm.
They're putting a red cord, and it has to be on the window outside so that it's visible to all, in the same way that when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, they took it and they had to put it on the lintels and the doorposts, okay, above their door. It had to be on the outside. It had to be visible, and it was red. Also, in verses 21 and 22 of Exodus 12, he says, I think it's 12, yeah. He says, then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and take yourselves lambs and slay the Passover lamb. And here's the first image of the Passover lamb. Mm-hmm. Okay, what did the Apostle John say? Okay, as he wrote about, behold, I think it's
the Lamb of God
who taketh away the sin of the world. Exactly. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of that blood to the basin, to the lintel, and the two doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of this house until morning. Here's the next parallel. Okay? Where is it that Rahab's family are safe? Only inside. If the spy said, if any of them come outside and they die, that is the blood on their head. It is not going to be on our head. So it's really a very much an image here. It's another image of Passover. So this area in the home was a safe zone from destruction. Now, it says also in this passage that two spies hide in the hills away from the pursuers for 3 days.
Why 3 days?
Why 3 days?
Jesus was in the tomb 3 days.
Right. You don't have to turn here, but that's exactly what the Matthew 16:21 passage says. Jesus says in Matthew 16:21, if you see in the notes, he says to the disciples, for I will be betrayed, and I will be crucified, and I will be in the tomb 3 days. He tells them 3 days. Now, I'm going to propose an idea here, because remember, things that are taught in the Bible are true history, but they're also typological. We see many, 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 many examples of this. They're a truth that also becomes a future truth in a future time in history. So, I want you to turn to, let's turn first to Ephesians 4. Go all the way back to the other end of the Bible, to Ephesians chapter 4. And we're going to look at verses 8 and 9. This is a very interesting comment that Paul makes here. So let's read it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. He says, therefore it says, and this is a quote from the Old Testament, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives and gave gifts to men. Now, you don't have to turn here if you don't want to, but this is actually a reference to Luke 16, verses 22 and following.
Abraham.
Yes, it was this place that Jesus calls Abraham's bosom. Bosom. And is held close to himself, Abraham's bosom. And of course, we find that this place was where all the Old Testament saints who died in faith were. Now, why could they not go directly to heaven? Why were they in Abraham's bosom?
Because Jesus hadn't risen. He hadn't gone to heaven yet.
He hadn't died and paid the price yet for them, and he had not ascended. So, when he dies, during this 3-day period, there's some interesting events that occur. Okay? One of those events is what we just read in Ephesians here in verse 8, before verse 8. And he ascended on high. He led a host of captives. He transports all these Old Testament saints from Abraham's bosom to heaven.
But wasn't this after he died?
Yes.
Yes.
It was in that period between his death and his resurrection. That 3-day period. So that's one thing that happens. Now, it also says, let's go to verse 9 now of Ephesians 4.
Well, now you skipped, and he gave gifts to men.
Well, I think there's multiple meanings for that. One of the gifts was what he just did. What an incredible gift. He transported them from this holding place to the ability to be in heaven and to be in the presence of God. That's certainly one of the great gifts he gave them. I think Paul's allusion here also is, because he's going to talk about also the gifts that Christ gave to the church and to individuals inside the church also. And of course later on that's discussed in this passage in Ephesians 4. But let's read verse 9 of Ephesians 4. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? Now what does that mean?
He already used to be there.
Why would he descend into the lower parts of the earth?
I think he wanted to tell it is done.
Who does he want to tell?
Those the demons. Yeah.
Okay, so we know that there are some interesting individuals that are locked away. And
it could be the saints as
yeah.
well.
Well, no, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
In 2 Peter chapter, you don't have to turn if you don't want to, but in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, he says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned,
okay.
These are the fallen angels that came down to earth and created all the havoc in Genesis chapter 6 that we read about. Okay?
2 Peter.
Chapter 2, verse 4. He says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into, hell is a really not good word there. Really the best word to use in the Greek is the abyss. He cast them into the abyss.
Is that a holding place for hell?
It's a holding place for these fallen angels.
Is that the fallen angels?
Is that why the Catholic religion refers to it as purgatory?
Yes. They also refer to purgatory because of what we just read in Luke 16, too. Okay? Because they don't correctly understand what we're going through, the passages we're going through right now. He says, for if he did not spare these angels when they sinned, but cast them into abyss and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. Okay? Now, so this group is put into this place called the abyss. We see them later on, interestingly enough, in Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 11, where they're talked about again. Because at that point, they're let out. And really bad things happen when they're let out. We went through that when we went through the book of Revelation. What we find here is that Christ did a second thing during this 3-day period between his physical death and his physical resurrection. And that is, he made an announcement to these guys and said, I think, who said it? Somebody said, Mike, did you say it? Somebody said, in essence, the jig is up. Okay?
Yeah.
You have lost. The strategy that you have tried will not work. I have overcome it. Done.
It's done.
It's done. So he made that announcement too. Now it's interesting, if you want to turn to an interesting passage, turn back to Isaiah 44. There's an allusion to this event that Isaiah gives us. And it's Isaiah 44. I'm going to start in 22 to give you a little bit of context. He says, God's speaking to Israel here. He says, I've wiped out your transgression like a thick cloud. In other words, I don't know if anyone was up. I woke up last night at about 4 in the morning, I think, got up, looked out the window.
You saw nothing. Nothing, right?
That's what came to my mind when I read this passage today. Anything that would have been 100 yards away, I couldn't see. It was blotted out.
It's like a pilot, and he's up in the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to bring her down,
Yep.
set her down. And there's no visual
There's
contact.
no visual.
No visual.
This is the image here. I have wiped out your transgressions like a thick cloud, and your sins like last night, heavy mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. And in verse 23, shout for joy, O heavens, for the Lord has done it. Shout joyfully, you lower parts of the earth. That, I think, is an allusion to Luke 16, in this place called Abraham's bosom. Break forth in a shout of joy. In other words, what Isaiah is saying here, in essence, is, hey guys, you've got a future, and something's going to happen, and you're going to be really pleased when it happens. Okay? But it only occurs, a long time in the future when Christ actually does this. So, it's an interesting thing that goes on here, I think. So, I'm wondering, and this is just my speculation, did Satan, quote, pursue Christ the 3 days between his death and his physical resurrection?
What happened in that time frame?
Well, what?
Go ahead. What actually happened around the earth at the time on all of the peoples? What actually happened, and how much was he in control of at that time?
Well, I don't think the things that we're focused on here in the passages we're reading is not so much what's going on in the earth, on the earth, but rather it's what's going on, if you want to use the phrase, in the earth, in this place called the abyss and in this holding place. Mm-hmm. That's the focus of what is being talked about.
Well, I think Satan, once he was on the cross and had died, I think Satan thought he'd won.
He did. He did.
Satan what? Had won it all.
Turn,
The victory.
if you're in Ephesians,
That's the reason I asked the question.
Well, how is it lies through all the stories?
just a second. Turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Now keep in mind, I'm asking a question. The pursuers have pursued for 3 days. Could this be typological? Is there another unique 3-day period where pursuers are pursuing, and yet they cannot find who they're trying to seek, and they cannot understand the strategy of those that they're trying to seek?
I'm sorry, what's the time pursue?
To pursue means to run after, to try to find.
Chase.
Okay? So,
Isn't that what we just read in where they had to go to the hill country and
yeah,
find out?
right. Okay? Now, here's again, I think it's typological. You make your own decision, but in 1 Corinthians 2, because I just asked the question, could it be that Satan was, in that sense, pursuing Christ during that 3 days that he was, quote, in the tomb? Notice what we read here in 1 Corinthians 2. He says, starting verse 7, or let's start 6. Yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature, that is, What he means, those that have insight, spiritual understanding. A wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age. And that word in the Greek means not kings on the earth. It means spiritual entities, principalities and powers in the heavenly places. Okay? He says, but they are passing away. Verse 7. But we speak God's wisdom in a mystery. The mystery, the hidden wisdom, which God predestined before the ages for our glory. So here's a plan, a strategy that God came up with, but it was unclear. It was mysterious. It couldn't be totally understood. Verse 8, that wisdom which none of the rulers of this age, again, the spiritual entities, okay, the fallen angels, Satan, had understood, for if they had understood it, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. See? The very way in which Satan conspired to do everything to create the situation to get Christ on the cross. Everything that, all the people he used, all the mock trials he created, all the antipathy that he created in the crowd that said crucify him, all of these things that he created to bring this crescendo where the Son of Glory was crucified.
Wasn't that God's plan all along?
It was. But what I'm saying is, he did not fully understand it.
You're talking about Satan.
Because what Paul just says here, if he had realized what he was really doing, he was being played. He was being played. He was doing the very thing that God, in the greater sense, was allowing him to do so that forgiveness of sins could occur on the cross and his own power over the life of every human being was broken.
So he had a false sense of success.
Right. He didn't know what he was doing. In his arrogance, he ended up falling into God's trap. And that's the interesting mystery of the cross.
All right, go on.
So, I'm saying, could this passage also be typological in Joshua, where the pursuers pursue for 3 days, but they can't find who they're pursuing? Okay? Until finally, something happens.
Okay, I don't understand.
Well, we'll talk about it later. It's just an idea. See if you think it's typological also.
Do you define when you say typological?
It's a type. It's a type that occurs at a moment in time or in a moment in history that becomes a type for other events occurring in the future that are like it, that are maybe more clear. It's, for instance, the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. God says, take him to Mount Moriah, take a knife and kill him. It's like, well, this is the son I waited all this time for, all right? And so what do we get? It's typological, right? What are we told in the New Testament about the sacrifice of Isaac? Who is typologically Isaac? Jesus. Okay? Who is typologically the Passover lamb? Jesus.
So here you say that 3 days they were hiding. Is 3 days Satan was chasing Jesus?
Because the king of Jericho is the enemy of them, who wants them dead. I'm going to go on and give you a little bit more of this here in a few minutes, okay? Just consider it. I'm throwing it out there. There's so many typologies in the Bible. They're just filled with typologies. So the red cord, of course, that Michael was telling us about, okay? Now we're getting to the red cord, Michael. Okay? Well, now we're getting to the red cord. Okay?
Oh, boy, I'm glad.
Of course, it has two different values. It has a highly practical value.
Yeah, to escape.
Yes, to physically let them down off the window of the wall so that they can get away. But it also, I think, has a spiritual value, too.
Wait a minute, they used a rope.
They did.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about.
The cord.
Scarlet cord.
The rope.
Oh, I thought they were two different items.
No,
Oh.
Same one.
there's
Same
nothing
one.
purple, Mikey.
Yeah.
That's what's purple.
Yeah.
No, you're right. The cords and the rope are one and the same.
They are.
And it's red.
You kind of got that. That's red. I think.
Now, here's what I think is interesting about, from a spiritual standpoint, the possible meaning of this. I think it's connected to the promise in the land. I want you to turn to 1 Chronicles 16. Back to your, well, depending on where you are. I was still in the New Testament there, so I got to go way back. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. This is kind of a song that's being sung. It's a celebration that David puts on concerning the ark and the arrangements for it, and it's put in kind of a poem or song format. And he's talking. Well, I'll start in 16. He's kind of reiterating Jewish history, and he says, "The covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac." There's the word again. We just saw that one, Aleph. Okay. And also confirmed it to Jacob as a statute, to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, "To you I will give the land of Canaan," as in Hebrew, the word is not best translated portion, but rather its best translation is cord. As a cord of your inheritance. Isn't that interesting? He calls it the cord of their inheritance. And certainly was the cord of someone's inheritance. Who would that be? In our story in Joshua.
Oh, the two guys that escaped.
Mm-mm.
Oh, no. That's right. Yeah, no.
Whose cord of inheritance is it in our story? Who's going to inherit in this story? Rahab. She's going to inherit national Israel.
Got it.
Okay? It's the cord of her inheritance. It's also, if you want to move to your right more, to Psalm, there's another reference to it in Psalm 105. Psalm 105, verses 8 to 11. Again, it's all about the promise given to Abraham here and how it's fulfilled. Psalm 105, starting verse 8. He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, the covenant which he made with Abraham, and there's the word again, oath to Isaac. And he says, then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the cord of your inheritance. So, used again, same word, used the same way there.
Is cord meaning quarter? It's not meaning a measurement?
It's meaning a rope, a cord. Think of it like this, okay? Norman will like this, okay? When you become an officer, okay, and you have these things they put on your shoulders. Braids, cords.
Yes.
Same idea, okay? It signifies who you are and your rank.
Very much so.
Same idea, right here. Okay? Now, here's our question. I'm going to D here. Was Rahab's visitation by the spies just a coincidence? No. Now I'm going to build you an evidence here. It's a legal suit. I'm going to argue as the prosecutor here that this is indeed not the case. That we are going to find her guilty, or find God guilty, however you want to put it, saying this was not a coincidence. Okay? Now, Matthew 1. Turn to Matthew 1. And this is, of course, part of the lineage of Christ.
You have your
Yeah, you can look at your chart here.
genealogy of
The
Christ.
genealogy is here through the stepfather of Jesus, Joseph. It's his genealogy. In Luke, we have probably, it's a somewhat different genealogy, and we believe the genealogy there is actually the genealogy through Mary. Okay, so we have two different genealogies
No,
here.
wait a minute. That's not what this chart says.
Well, disregard this chart, I'm saying. I think the best evidence, people dispute it to some extent, but I think the best evidence is that, are you talking about that Luke is not through Mary?
It says line of Mary is Matthew 1. Line of Joseph is Luke 3.
Oh, did I just reverse it then? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I reversed it. I'm corrected.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm just reading what
Oh,
it
yeah,
says.
very good. Yeah. Now,
Teacher corrected him.
yes, that's right. That's right. Now, it shows us in Matthew 1, it says to Judah, of course we know who Judah was, tribe named after him, were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and to Perez was born Haran, and to Hezron, I just marked that word out, unfortunately. And to Hezron, Ram. To Ram was born Amminadab. To Amminadab, Nahshon. To Nahshon, Salmon. And to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab. And to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth. And to Obed was born Jesse. And to Jesse was born King David. Okay? So we see Rahab is in the lineage of Christ himself, because obviously Jesus is called the Son of David in Isaiah and other places. Now, turn, if you would, to see this a little bit more clearly. I want you to go back in the Old Testament now to 1 Chronicles 2. Because I want you to see kind of who these people were. These names.
People.
Yeah. So we're going to look at two people here so you can understand better off who they were, because they're two that are named around the time that this is going on with Rahab. So 1 Chronicles chapter 2, then we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. Here again is part of this genealogy. Starting verse 10, 1 Chronicles 2. And Ram became the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab became the father of Nahshon. That tells us an interesting thing here. The leader of the sons of Judah. So Nahshon wasn't just some guy that randomly was in the tribe of Judah, but rather he was a leader in the tribe of Judah. And then it says, Nahshon became the father of, here it's Salma or Salmon. Okay, sometimes it's put differently. And Salma or Salmon became the father of Boaz. And then, of course, it says Boaz became the father of Obed, and it goes on. So we learn that this Nahshon is a leader. Now, I want you to turn over further to the left to Numbers chapter 7. We're going to learn something else here. To learn some more information about some of these people. Numbers chapter 7. We're picking up pieces of the puzzle here. Ann and I were talking about that the other week.
Yeah.
Pieces of the puzzle. Numbers chapter 7. This is talking about the dedication that occurs of the, it was a tabernacle, and this dedication involves different offerings being made by leaders of the different tribes. That's what's going on here, okay, in this particular chapter. So we're going to start in verse 10 of this chapter 7, Numbers. And the leaders offered the dedication offering for the altar when it was anointed, So the leaders offered their offering before the altar. Then the Lord said to Moses, let them present their offering, 1 leader each day, for the dedication of the altar. Now the one who has presented his offering on the first day was Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, of the tribe of Judah. So, we learned some interesting things here. Who was Rahab married to?
Rahab was married to
Solomon, whose father was Nahshon, who is called a prince of Judah. So she not only got out of there, she not only was transported to Israel, into the camp, but then she married the son of the prince of the tribe of Judah. She became royalty. Isn't it interesting? So, now, let's go on a little bit. Thus, we see in the genealogy of Matthew 1, Rahab is the great-grandmother of King David.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, we see in the genealogy here this guy Boaz, too. See it? Remember the genealogy?
Yeah.
In Matthew 1? Okay? Boaz is the husband, eventually, of this woman named Ruth. We find, of course, the story in Ruth 4, verses 11 and 12. Okay? And the story, well, let me finish this first before I tell you. So, Ruth becomes the husband of Boaz. Ruth, of course, is not a Jew. She's a Gentile. She's a Moabitess. And she marries this guy named Boaz, who also is a very prominent person, too. So, we have Rahab, a Gentile woman, who becomes a Gentile bride, and we have Ruth, a Gentile woman, who becomes a Gentile bride, both of them in the lineage of Jesus.
What about Tamar? She was
Now-
married to Jacob.
Here we go. Here we go. I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Okay.
No
Now,
problem.
let me. That's our next point, Ann. I'm glad you're thinking that direction because it's exactly where we want to go. Now, also we see in Ruth the story that Boaz becomes what's called the kinsman redeemer, because Naomi, who is the mother-in-law of Ruth, she loses her land because of a debt. Okay? But the rule of law in Israel says you can't lose your land forever, and if you have a relative who's got some money, the relative needs to come and pay your debt and get the title deed to your property back. And that's exactly what the story is here. But of course, Boaz does two things. He not only gets the title deed back for Naomi's land, but he also gets a wife in the process too. Okay? Who ends up. Now, very good question here. I want you to turn to Genesis 38. Because you remember also in this genealogy we read in Matthew 1, it talks about Tamar. And it also talks about this person named Perez. So go to, I gotta get there myself. Go to Genesis, and we're going to go to chapter 38. Now you know how every family has its story of the black sheep. This is it. Okay, because this is this is not the story that if you were wanting to describe how elegant your family line was, this would not be the story you'd want to share, all right? So I'm not going to have you read the whole thing, but basically what happens is Judah, one of his sons is married to this woman named Tamar. And Tamar gets the idea in her mind for a variety of reasons that she's going to pose as a prostitute. So she fixes herself up in a way that apparently she can't be easily recognized, and she comes on to Judah.
Well, she's a widow.
She's a widow, but she ends up coming on to Judah. And Judah doesn't end up resisting this, and so they have relations with each other, and she ends up becoming pregnant, which is what she was trying to do. So it says,
So the reason why she did this was that it's verse 14. It says, for she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as wife.
yes,
She had been promised that, right?
yes, right. So what happens is that, and I'll go to verse 26 here in chapter 38, and Judah recognized them and said about what Tamar did, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her my son Shelah. In other words, the Levirate marriage. Since she was a widow, Judah, by law, should have given his next son to be her husband, but he wouldn't do it. Okay? So she concocts this strategy of how she's going to do this, okay? So that's what is meant by she is more righteous than I, as much as I did not give her my son. And then he goes on, he says, and she did not have, and he didn't have relations with her again. Verse 27, it came about at the end of time she was giving birth, and behold, there were twins in her womb. And of course, they are named. One of them is named Perez. And that's the person in the lineage we're talking about.
Sounds like Mexican to me.
So it's a rather convoluted story, but Perez, of course, is in here. Now, but there's a very interesting thing we have to figure out here. Perez, of course, in the technical terminology, is a bastard.
So it's twins.
So is the twin too. Okay, we're not just picking on. Okay, but since he's in the lineage. Okay, very good, yeah. Now, so here's the problem we have. All right, turn to Deuteronomy 23.
But you missed verse 28 where a scarlet cord was tied around his...
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Come on.
Do it. No, go ahead. Read it.
Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first.
Right. So again, remember how typological thing? Typological. The story repeats. The story becomes more specific over time. So turn to Deuteronomy, because we got a little problem here.
I think you got a big problem, not a little.
Well, the genealogy is very interesting, isn't it? It isn't exactly what you call the cleanest story in the world. You got a prostitute.
The thing about Bible is
Yeah.
it covers not only...
Oh, absolutely. It's realistic.
Not everybody walked on water.
No, it's very realistic. So you've got a former prostitute and two Gentile women in the lineage of Christ. Now go to Deuteronomy 2. And I'm going to show you the next problem we have.
Tamar was Jewish, wasn't she?
Yes.
No.
No, she wasn't.
No.
She was Gentile too.
Okay.
Okay. So Deuteronomy 2. I'm sorry, 2. Deuteronomy 23. I had verse 2 in my mind.
I'm sorry, I get you all mixed up.
Deuteronomy 23.
23.
Verse what?
We're going to look at verse 2, verses 2 and 3 actually. So, we have two major problems occurring here that have to be resolved. Let me show you what they are. Verse 2. No one of illegitimate birth, that would be Perez, shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord.
That's a monumental problem.
That's a problem. The bastard son cannot be a legitimate heir, and his family and his descendants cannot be a legitimate heir for 10 generations. That's a long
How
time.
come the Lord didn't have ICE back then?
Have what?
ICE.
You mean the
The military that's rounding up the...
rounding them up, yeah.
Calling him Spanish or Mexican.
Well, Jesus was called a bastard child.
He was too. That's true. Now we got a second problem here. Let's read our second problem.
He wasn't.
All right.
But the people thought he was.
Verse 3. no Ammonite or Moabite, and by the way, in the Hebrew, it means male. Okay? These words in the Hebrew are male. No male Ammonite nor male Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. So, what was Rahab? She was a
Female.
She was, but she was a Ammonite. And who was Ruth?
A Moabite.
A Moabite. Okay. All right.
But they were female.
But they were females. That's what you got. But shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of these descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is why I'm telling you, Ruth was chosen. It was a very Rahab was chosen. It was a very well-crafted strategy. Count from Perez to David. And what do you get? Count them. The generations. 10. So by the 10th generation, when King David is born, now all that lineage is legitimate. It's there, designed. And one of the things I think, again, the Word of God is an integrated message system from outside of time. Because there's no way that the characters in these stories could have figured this out and created these situations.
So God is an architect.
He's an architect, exemplar through history. It's an integrated message system that comes from outside of time. There's no other way it could be.
How did that happen in regards to then, as he drew those plans up, what I'm trying to think about is the reaction of Satan and God's philosophy, because in essence he was leading Satan, and Satan didn't even realize he was getting led. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely, because, one of the reasons is because when we read in Isaiah chapter 14, the story of Satan's fall, he goes through the 5 I wills. I will ascend to the Mount of Assembly in the recesses of the north. And the 5th one is, I will make myself like the Most High. In other words, Satan is the greatest megalomaniac that has ever existed.
All right, we got it.
Okay? And therefore, he's blind by his own arrogance.
There's a few of those walking on.
There's a lot of them. He's blinded by his own arrogance. All right. As Gary sometimes said, let's land the plane here. So go back, move over a few pages to Joshua again.
Is that what we started with?
There's where we were. The pieces of the puzzle we've been putting together. It's a fascinating puzzle. So Joshua chapter 2, let's read now verses 22 through 24. And they departed and came to the hill country and remained there for 3 days. And the pursuers returned. Now the pursuers had sought them all along the road, but had not found them. Then the 2 men returned and came down from the hill country and crossed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun, and they related to him all that had happened to them. And here's their great military strategic information. Verse 24, and they said to Joshua, surely the Lord has given us the land into our hands, and all the inhabitants of the land, moreover, have melted away before us.
That's very different from previous
Yes.
episodes.
What a contrast to earlier in Numbers, when Numbers 13, as a matter of fact, where the 12 are sent out, and what is it that the 10 say? We can't do it. We can't possibly conquer this land. And these 5 have the faith to say it's been given into our hands.
So in both cases, 2 people were delivered.
I think that might be typological too.
What's the relationship going to be after we leave tonight in the discussion between you and her?
Oh, between. I don't know.
I find it interesting that the Amorites and the Moabites came from Lot and his daughters.
Yes.
And so these are the two that are mentioned, especially that
Yeah.
are condemned.
And isn't it also interesting that Lot's family, being told absolutely precisely what was going to happen, what did the angels that came there finally have to do?
Came where?
To Sodom.
Oh,
What did the angels finally have to do in the story? After saying, you got to get out, you got to get out, you got to get out, the Lord's going to destroy it with fire, what did they do? The angels, it says in the story, had to grab them and pull them to safety.
and then Lot's wife.
They weren't exactly people of faith. They unwillingly left because God had his plan for them.
So you say
Or Lot's wife
Amorites
didn't get very
And
far.
Moabites
and Moabites were
from Lot and his two daughters
Mm-hmm.
when they sinned. They got him drunk.
I didn't.
Yeah,
Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
right.
I missed that.
They decided they were going to get their own offspring
Mm-hmm.
and decided this is the way they're going to do it, by scheme again, just like Tamar had her scheme.
Mm-hmm.
So, the spies left, and then Rahab is faced with what I think may be the most difficult part of her ordeal. Can you imagine being her? They've left. You know that 7 miles away approximately, there's a huge army. When will Israel invade? When will this all occur? Will they keep their promise? I would be thinking to myself, are they going to find the house? Are they going to see the cord? There's an awful lot of soldiers that are going to be going around this place.
But at the same time, she was the only one who had hope.
She did.
She knew that at least I had a chance.
Do you think that God spoke to her at that time?
I'm suspicious that God revealed many things to her based on everything that we've read. He had her hand absolutely on that woman. We know that from the scriptures.
Jacqueline.
Yes, Jack.
I just happen to think, since the walls all fell down and she was on the wall, maybe her house is the only one left standing and the walls all fell down. That's why they could find her.
I think you're absolutely right.
I think that would happen.
It had to have been that way.
Something like that, where she's usually picked out.
Yep. It had to have been that way.
Red.
Mhm.
Yeah. But
Can you see the picture? Can you see the picture? If we only had the photograph. After 7 times around on the 7th day, okay,
Everything.
they fall down except this one section doesn't fall. It's got this red cord around it. It's got all these people inside of it. Wouldn't you love to have that as a photograph?
Yeah.
I have heard too that when the walls fell, they didn't necessarily fall this way. That God took the wall in the
Yeah.
ground and down.
Yeah, we're going to look in a little bit when we get to this about some of the archaeology of the walls, at least what we've been able to discover through excavations, because it is very
Did
interesting.
you say we?
My wife is looking into this right now.
I
Okay.
asked a question earlier about what the discussion would be between the two of them.
There are many interesting
I
discussions
have
between.
many books.
That's right, she does. She's collected many books. Very
about
good.
books.
Now, Rahab, I think, is typological of every believer. Think about it. She lived in what was a hostile culture. So do we. She had an enemy king, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
His name is Satan. Okay? Her king would have destroyed her. It says in 1 Peter 5:8 that Satan is a roaring lion trying to seek those he can devour.
Mm-hmm.
She had to wait until the day of her deliverance. And so do we.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very much typological for her too.
Plus, she was a Gentile
Bride.
bride.
Ends up being a Gentile bride. And what is the church? The Gentile bride of Christ. Another typology, of course. So because of her acts and faith, Rahab had become a traitor to her own culture, and she ended up being a pilgrim in a land that was not the land of her birth. That is, she's transferred to Israel. We too, in the same way, typologically, are pilgrims. Turn to 1 Peter 2. Way in the other end of the Bible.
Did you say she is a pilgrim not in her land or in her land?
She's a pilgrim who had to leave her land and had to go to another land. That's a pilgrim, by definition.
She married a Jew guy.
Go to let's see what I'm looking at here. 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2. Here's what Peter says about us as Christians, as believers. Verse 11. He says, Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers. That's what he calls us. We live in an alien world because we've been transferred, Paul tells us, from the kingdom of darkness with its king Satan to the kingdom of, quote, God's beloved Son. A transfer has occurred. All right? Transfer has occurred. We now live as a different type of citizen in a hostile culture.
Now, Apostle Paul also says that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Where? Do you remember?
It's in Ephesians. I have to
Ephesians.
find it. Now look also at Hebrews chapter 11, since we can go back from 1 Peter, back through James to Hebrews chapter 11. I want to look verses. This is about our gal here, verses 8, 9. It says, By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive as inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Does this sound familiar to you? Mm-hmm. That's Rahab's position too. Okay, and it says, For he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He'll find it one day. It will be in heaven. And he says, verse 11, By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive. And it goes on, and it talks about her. And then verse 13 of that chapter, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. The same as we, the same as the church. I won't go into it, but there's some other really interesting passages there you might want to look at this week. I think the First Chronicles and the passages from the Psalms are also very interesting as they elaborate on this theme of being aliens and strangers and pilgrims in the world around them. So as we said, that spies report the most important information, and it really wasn't military in nature. You know, God has given us the land. All the people are terrified. Let's go. So, that's chapter 2. And I've kept my promise. Only 2 weeks on chapter 2.
Good for you.
So we'll move into chapter 3 next week.
Can I ask another
Yes.
question?
Mm-hmm.
Have you already got your questions made up?
No,
No?
no, I mean, I cannot go ahead of him, so I usually do it on Saturday or Sunday.
Okay. I figured with all the stuff that those questions are going to be
Study your notes.
loaded.
Anishka's going to have questions for you next week.
Oh, yeah.
We're ready. We're ready. Already.
The professor shall...
That's right. The professor.
The professor.
No, I'm student the same like you guys are.
All right.
I'm so anxious that you will ask me something and that will be like, I don't know.
Hey, Anne, would you close this briefly with prayer? Would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dear Lord Jesus, we've come tonight with open hearts, ears to hear, to learn. We're so grateful for all the praying the Lord has done in your word to show us the truth from your word. Lord, we thank you that you put them there. We just have to dig a little to see them. We thank you that they're plain when we see them. And we just thank you, Lord, for your grace, for your love, for your care for each of us. We thank you for the week that's passed, and you've brought us through, and for the week ahead, which you are going to take us through as well, one step at a time, giving us grace, hopefully, to face each situation that comes our way. Lord, go with us. Go with Tim and Anna as they continue to study. Go with each of us as we continue to be learners of your word. These things we ask in your precious name.
Amen.